welcome. Thank you for attending this virtual conference from the Supply Chain Sustainability School. And the topic really that we want to talk about today is to help Welsh suppliers bid better for public sector work. And I'm going to do an initial share screen just to run through a couple of housekeeping slides and to introduce our speakers, after which I hope to engage them in what I hope will be some really useful conversation and will help you as Welsh businesses trying to supply to the public sector understand how better to increase your chances of a successful bid. So let me first of all do a quick share screen and we'll run through a couple of housekeeping things. So that's the title of the event, and if I can just get my mouse in the right place, we will look at the next slide. So because this is a conference with quite a large number of participants, the size of the audience means that unlike when we deliver a workshop, this needs to be more of a one-way presentation from our speakers to you. But that's not to say that we can't engage with you and take your questions. So you'll notice at the bottom of the screen, if you're using Zoom, which you are, there is a Q&A box. If you'd like throughout the event to write any questions you have in that Q&A box, my colleague Rosie in the background will monitor those, and we will make time either during or at the end of the session to cover off your questions. Unfortunately, we can't see you or hear you directly because Zoom has turned off your mics and cameras. So I'd like to make a few introductions. My name's Dave Emery from the Supply Chain Sustainability School. One of my roles in the school with my colleague Rosie is to organise what we call our Wales Leadership Group. And this is a group of partners of the school who have got a particular interest in doing business in Wales, or indeed are Indigenous Welsh businesses. And the purpose of the leadership group is collectively to decide what are the issues facing Welsh construction and infrastructure, and hopefully we at the school can either create learning materials or develop events and workshops that address some of those issues. And this workshop is an output from that. We felt it was really important to help Welsh businesses understand better how they can become successful bidders for public sector work. So we've invited representatives of 4 partners of the school, all experts in their field. If I can just run through some introductions. First of all, we've got Kevin Shaxson, who is the category manager for SUSCAP, which stands for the South East and Mid Wales Collaborative Construction Framework. And SUSCAP is now in its 3rd iteration. So SUSCAP 3 draws together the expertise of pre-qualified, experienced small, medium and large contractors to provide various school and public building construction works, including modular and demountable solutions. And their range of values is between 250,000 and 100 million. So its mission is to achieve best value arrangements for South East and Mid Wales through competitive procurement. Aled Huish is from Transport for Wales. He is a procurement and supply chain professional, 17 years plus experience in lots of sectors, including manufacturing, oil and gas, housing and energy. And he holds the role of supply chain manager at Transport for Wales, which he's held for nearly 3 years now. Stefan Isles from Welsh Water is category manager within the Welsh Water procurement team. So his main areas of focus are procurement and contract management of capital works, water network materials and engineering products. Stefan's worked with water and wider infrastructure projects for around 15 years, and he's got experience across water, rail and even nuclear. So he's leading the development of sustainable procurement strategy and implementation on behalf of the department, in which role he needs to engage with internal and external stakeholders. Tanya Silva is the North Wales Construction Partnership. So she graduated as an industrial engineer in Mexico City, and she's worked for lots of major organizations in Mexico and Europe, and prior to moving to the UK. So she joined Denbighshire County Council as Business Systems Manager for the Design and Construction team, but she's now appointed as Manager of the North Wales Construction Partnership and the associated frameworks in that region. So that's our list of expert speakers. I'm going to stop sharing the screen for a moment, because the format of today will be really to dive down into our speakers' expertise and knowledge as quickly as possible. So I'm going to invite each of our speakers to talk with it. There are not going to be any PowerPoint slides or supporting materials. So I'm going to invite them each to cover a particular topic initially, and then we're going to expand that conversation into other areas, a much more of a freestyle conversation later on. But initially, I'd like to ask Aled, if I could, first of all, because it seems to us that there is an awful lot of legislation, both UK-wide and specifically Welsh, that people in the public sector, such as our speakers, need to be mindful of and operate within. And as public sector bodies, they are perhaps exposed to levels of scrutiny that we in the private sector might find intrusive and uncomfortable. So they have to be highly accountable and recognise the legislation that constrains them, or indeed gives them opportunities. So just before I invite Aled to speak, I should just mention that this conference is being recorded and will be made available afterwards. So Aled, can I ask you to start for a few minutes, please, and just talk about some of the relevant legislation that affects you and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously the key thing from a public sector perspective is the public contract regulations in the first part, or when it comes to Transport for Wales, we've actually got two sides to this. So our Transport for Wales group are covered by the public contract regulations, and our Transport for Wales Rail Limited covered by the utilities regulations, which I know Stefan would be covered by as well. So you have to think about those two aspects of the legislation there, and obviously from a particularly Welsh perspective, I think one of the key things is the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Now this has been around for a few years now, and most or all Welsh public sector organisations are bound by this. Some are more tightly than others, but we do seem all to adopt it as a piece of legislation there that we are keen to promote, and from a Welsh perspective is very important. So you've got the 7 wellbeing goals, looking at trying to promote certain aspects of wellbeing within Wales. And I think within this, a lot of people think about the economic side of things, and think about things like apprenticeships and other and spend with local suppliers. But there's also other areas such as cultural and Welsh language. So for people to understand a bit around about and to understand the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and to really give good answers, you really need to understand the different nuances within that. Now, every public sector organisation in Wales will have their own key goals when it comes to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and what they focus on, and different ways of measuring it. But it's something that binds us all. And within that, as well as the 5 ways of working. So demonstrating the 5 ways of working is also a very important part of demonstrating understanding of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And then moving on, there's the Ethical Employment and Supply Chain Code of Practice. Now, this is there to provide guidance and to for Welsh public sector organisations to take into account modern slavery, human rights, blacklisting, consideration of the living wage, to name just but a few. And so making sure that we are working with a supply chain that is ethical, and we don't have anything in our supply chain, and looking at the key risk areas as well, such as construction, such as uniform, food procurement, to make sure that we have an ethical supply chain within our suppliers, and then also the newest one is run by the Social Partnership Bill, where we are looking at fair work, making sure that the public procurement is taken into account that socio-economic equality. It's there to tighten procurement rules so that only contractors who provide fair work can get public contracts, and this all binds together the other two, Wellbeing and Future Generations Act and the Code of Practice that I've already mentioned as well, to make sure that it's tighter, and we are looking at those as part of our procurement. So I think the one, if one message I give to people on this call today is make sure you understand the different bits of legislation within Wales, because we are now being legislated to take those into account and make our procurements a lot tighter and our contracts a lot tighter when it comes to this sort of thing.
Thanks, Ali. I think some of the people on the call may well be familiar with well-being of future generations. As you said, it affects us all. Perhaps people might not be as familiar with the public contract regulations. I guess those are specific to you. What sort of implications do the contents of that act have for you? What does it cover, really?
Okay, so it provides essentially a framework by which we have to procure. So if the value of a contract is above a certain threshold, and the thresholds differ from services, goods, and then they're a lot higher for works. So anything that a contract that is over those thresholds, we have to go out to public tender, or sorry, we have to procure it in a compliant way, I should say. So that could take a form of a couple of things. We could go to tender and we have set timescales by which we have to run, and the process. There are different processes within that, whether it's an open tender, whether there's a PQQ stage, whether there's a lot of different aspects to this where the process by which, but it's a formal stage that we have to follow. So one of the things that so then another compliant route is the use of public sector frameworks as well. So you can see, if you see a public sector framework in place, that means we can use that means that framework has already gone through the process of awarding and through the compliant process, and then public sector organizations can call off those frameworks and run mini tenders, or there could be a direct award, and there's different types of framework agreement as well. There could be a dynamic purchasing system which you can add suppliers to and take suppliers off, whereas a fixed framework is fixed essentially for the term of that period of that contract. I think the key thing it stops us from doing is, I come from a mainly private sector background, where you could say that procurement is slightly easier because you can work with an approved supplier list. You can work with, you can speak to people and award business depending on how you want to do it. But in the public sector, we can't just award business to anyone. So when people come to me to say, oh, we've got this amazing product that I want you to look at, it's not necessarily easy for us to get access to that unless they're on a framework or they participate in a tender to win that work.
Thank you. I'm guessing that the public contract regulations you described are aligned with all the other legislation, and possibly when we're thinking about a tender, it's more than simply lowest price, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
I'm sure we'll explore that a little bit further on.
I'm sure, yeah. Yeah,
we'll explore that a little bit further on, and possibly we'll talk more about some of the benefits of frameworks, clearly from what you all do. But thanks for that opening piece, Ali, really appreciate it. I wanted to turn to Stefan next of all, because when we as a group started to plan the content, Stefan said, but we're different. We're Welsh Water, we're different. And I just wanted to give you a chance, Stefan, to talk about some of the differences in what Welsh Water does and some of your ambitions and targets for the future.
Yeah, thanks, David. And I suppose just echoing what Alid said previously, Welsh Water are bound by the utilities regulations, and it's interesting to hear that within TFW you have the two sets of regulations running at the same time. But again, both sets of regulations, make the organization conform to an open and ethical procurement process, essentially, with varying limits for works and services. I think one of the other key things for Welsh Water is, with its not-for-profit status and the fact that we're bound by the utilities regs, we're not actually bound by the Future Generations Act. However, our forward-looking 2050 vision aligns itself to the Act in a number of ways. So the 2050 vision is a publicly available document, and it sets out the organization's objectives and visions to become a world-class, resilient water infrastructure company for the benefit of Wales and the 3 million customers that take our services. I think the key thing for us, there are 18 strategic objectives within the 2050 vision, but what the organization have done is then align those to the Act to show where we can provide benefit in the services we deliver, and also how we interact with the supply chain. One of the key points for procurement at the moment is we're on a journey, I think, as you said earlier, David, to establish our sustainable procurement credentials, to look at what's important for us and how we can affect that 2050 vision, but more importantly, in the way that we engage with the supply chain, how the supply chain can help us on that journey as well.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, Stefan, you are not bound by the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. You are effectively excluded from it, but nevertheless, your strategies are very much to align yourselves with the general principles. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely, wherever we can.
And the obvious question for me is, why does the Act not affect you as an industry?
Because we are, I suppose, we're subservient to the Ofwat regulations, and through utilities, we're bound through that directorate, essentially.
Nevertheless, broadly, when I've listened to Aled, if I'm understanding you correctly, you are broadly looking for similar values. So you're not necessarily tendering on the basis of lowest price. You will be checking for your supply chain to be employing people fairly and giving them a living wage, etc., etc.
Absolutely, and I think that's why our 2050 vision aligns to the wellbeing goals. So in terms of modern slavery, in terms of fair living wage, in terms of local employment, we're looking for the same drivers essentially there as well.
And do you, like the others, have suppliers in framework agreements, or are you tendering what I guess are fairly large infrastructure projects on an individual basis?
It's a mix, if I'm honest. What we'll tend to do is, particularly from a construction standpoint, is we'll put in long-term frameworks that we'll then let our construction frameworks through. But it's generally not a spot market that we'll go to for construction. We'll look, if we can, to have those longer-term relationships through frameworks to build the pipeline of opportunities for the suppliers as well.
And in terms of contract values, the range from smallest to largest, is it possible to put figures on those?
I suppose it's difficult. As a procurement team, we will deal with anything from sort of 10,000 up into the millions as a department in terms of construction.
Okay. And, huge range
and other services. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you, Stefan. I wanted to turn to Kevin Shaxson next from SUSCAP. Talk about, I think when we were planning, Kevin, you were very much thinking about some of the community benefits, and that those were what you'd be seeking for. Do you want to just talk us through some of those? What are your strategies?
Yeah, no problem, David. Morning all. So I think, Aled has touched on a couple of the acts, so I won't dwell on those, but what I will do is look to expand on that and explain how we sort of go about asking those then, and also just provide a couple of examples. And I say a couple of examples because when you start looking at this field, there's so much you could be delivering within social value and community benefits, and there's so much like innovation that some of the ideas that come forward in tender packs still, I look at them sometimes and I think, well, I would never have thought of that, and how amazing to sort of think that way. So let's go back to the sort of start really, and like Alid touched on, yes, as public sector, we've got an obligation to sort of adhere to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act 2015. We got the Code of Practice, to name a couple of the policies there. But what that happens then within the public sector, and I'm sure the others on the call are the same as Cardiff and the SUSGAP framework. And when I say Cardiff, it's Cardiff Council that I work for, is we take those acts and we cascade those down into sort of the organisational policies then. So within Cardiff, the Cardiff Council will have their capital ambition, and then that will cascade down into departmental ones. So for instance, procurement, the team I work within, we've got our social responsible procurement policy, which is a bit of a mouthful to say. We also then got various kind of other policies that address these, such as the One Planet policy, which is looking at the environmental aspects and focusing on decarb agenda moving forward. And then we cascade those down into reflect what we do as a framework then. So we've lifted those policies, amended them to reflect then the South East and Mid Wales region that the SUSGAP framework operates within. So then we've built those back up to reflect like charters that we expect our contractors and our clients to adhere to when they're utilising the frameworks. And the reason why we've done that is, to try and support clients in delivering the Wellbeing of Future Generation Act. And so if we're able to sort of gather the stats and the reporting figures, then we can assist our clients in the reporting back to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Commission Office. So it's a bit of a round circle there about why and how we do it there. Again, probably taking it back to basics, what is social value? Well, it is looking at getting value for money out of the sort of social, economic and environmental aspects, and getting the best for the Welsh pound really. Community Benefits Toolkit has been around a good few years now, even before I was in procurement. So that has been around a long time, and a lot of the contractors are used to that kind of spreadsheet. But what you're seeing of late over the last few years is an emergence of different measures and different sort of reporting platforms. So, for instance, yes, that CB toolkit is still in existence, and it is still expected to be completed for certain Welsh Government funding. So, for instance, like the 21st Century Schools programme. But what you are also seeing now is what is called TOMS, target, objectives and measures. And not all authorities, and this is, I suppose, my caveat then, is there's not a, say, standard approach, unfortunately, in Wales as to how people approach social value. So, certain organisations, if I take Cardiff, for instance, we've decided to pilot the TOMS approach, and the Welsh TOMS then you've got as well, to actually build that in. And we use a platform called Social Value Platform Portal, to evaluate those, but to also report back those measures during the life of a contract. But I'm aware that Cardiff's approach there is probably very different to many authorities in Wales. Some don't want to use the TOMS approach and have got various KPIs and measures that they've developed themselves, and similar for the platforms that are used for collecting that data and measuring it. So, some have got bespoke platforms. There's also other, say, like industry platforms out there that they could be utilizing. So I suppose what I would say to the sort of supply chain really is really sort of pay attention to what is being asked of you from the client that you're sort of bidding for and the contractor that you're working for. Don't think it's the one approach suits all, really. In terms of then perhaps just using a couple of examples, like I said, the way Cardiff utilize it, we go out with a TOMS approach, which is focused on qualitative and quantitative measures. So it's looking at the value, say, of the social value bid, but then also looking at how that is being delivered. And it's probably important to pick up there as well that when we talk about social value, what we're looking at project level is not the sort of normal, say, corporate social responsible policies that you tend to deliver as an organization. We're looking at tailored approaches to projects and added value to those projects. So, for instance, a couple of examples I could provide here is the one I like to use is there's a charity that we network with, that they had an individual that had been for a tough time in life, decided to turn his life around, attended the sort of charity on a referral scheme, but then has actually gone on to do work experience and obtain permanent deployment through a construction firm within the sort of Wales region. Now, that is a great example there of taking someone that was deemed as perhaps NEETs, and taking them through that process then, and getting them into full-time work and training them up.
Kevin, just to interrupt a second, you used an acronym there, NEETs, for the benefit of the audience, the acronym.
I know you're going to tell me that then.
It's not in education or
long-term employment. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah. So so that was like an example there. Other examples we could be using is like focusing on the sort of supply chains itself. So looking at meet the buyer events, but not just the normal, say, meet the buyer events that you tend to see, but tailored ones towards the third sector. So we're seeing a lot of this now, that social enterprises are becoming ingrained within construction supply chains. And what we're seeing, they're providing services such as cleaning or catering facilities to sort of major projects and construction sites. Decarb again is another big focus that is coming forward, and that will develop as it moves along. But then it's considering like sort of mental well-being of not just the sort of employers, the contractors teams, but also the wider community. Biodiversity, how that could be supported there, and that's through like growth walls and the like. But also it's recognizing how policies are expanding as well, and sort of grant criteria. So for instance, within the 21st Century Schools programme at the moment, and this is going to be pushed out wider, Welsh Government insist anything over the 2 million mark now, a project bank account is required to be in place. And if we're not looking as a public sector body to have a bank account, we need to put that justification forward as to why not. And that is where there's increased pressure to sort of put fair practices in place really to address some of the issues that were happening. That's probably me there, David, in terms of the acts. Like I said, I didn't want to dwell on the acts too much. Aled covered that, but I wanted to just try and put a bit of a practical kind of focus on it, really. Yeah.
And what you've described is very reassuring, heartwarming indeed, when we think particularly about the mental health of people in construction. I think we've got one of the highest suicide rates, haven't we, men in construction? And what worried me very recently, I heard on the news an English government minister, and I can't remember who it was, but was implying that, this social value is all very good, but now the chips are down, we really need to go back to getting the best price. And I thought that was potentially going to undo many years of great work, some of which you've described. So there's some stuff I want to come back to, Kevin, later in the discussion, but thanks for that overview. Really pleased with that. Thank you. And I'm going to turn to Tanya Silva next, from North Wales Construction Partnership, because Tanya and I have been working together on some strategies for that framework, but she also made the remark, it's different from us in some ways, because you're in the north part of Wales. Tanya, would you like to give your perspective on this?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, David. I want to talk really about the perspective and challenges from North Wales. I think historically, Wales has been divided in three areas: the north, the mid, and the south. And each of them has their own culture. So it's like three little countries in one, if you like. And we are furthest away from Cardiff, which is the economic center of Wales. So at times it feels really far, sometimes even further than London. Historically, the North has had a close relationship with the North of England, and also its landscape is pretty much rural, with very little industry. A quarter of the population on Wales lives in the North, and therefore we only get a quarter of the funding. It doesn't really have large organizations, and the public sector are the major employers in the region. Also, it doesn't have a large enough market to sustain this large industry. The infrastructure that we have in the North, in North Wales in particular, is limiting to be able to move goods. We don't have the best railway network, and our roads are limiting. Tourism is a very important industry for the region, and the landscape of the area is something that's very important for the community. We have a low density population, due to the rurality of the area, and a high migration of skills that go to find work elsewhere. So it's like we have a number of issues that we need to tackle in North Wales. The construction sector mainly consists of local SMEs. We have a limited number of trades and consultancies, and it varies in the region. So sometimes when we have procurement regulations or priorities, more like where we want to spend our investment more locally, then it becomes very difficult when the industry that you're trying to procure is not really there. And I know that the efforts are being made currently, in particular by the North Wales the deal to develop and grow the industry. But it has to be proportionate to the investment and proportionate to the money that we are going to have available over the next few years. The current investment that is boosting now the construction industry in the region is the 21st Century Schools program. And as we know, it's a one-off. So we don't know what next after that funding runs out. So what we have taken an approach to have a very strong collaboration with the industry, an open and honest approach, try to get our clients really involved and on board on having a more transparent discussions around budget, around priorities, around challenges that we have within our budgets. One thing that is very important to us communities are our absolute priority, and all of our expenditure needs to be tailored to deliver and maximize the impact of that investment in each of our regions. So within North Wales, we have also two different landscapes, the East and the West. The East is closer to the North of England, so it tends to have that really close relationship with England, and the West is Anglesey, Conwy and Gwynedd. They are more rural, and it's a different landscape, and we have to target it in a slightly different way. So that's, I think, what I can say up to now about the perspective from North Wales and the challenges that we have. Thanks.
Thanks, Tanya. Just to expand on the type of projects you're trying to deliver through the framework, what are the range of projects, and what's the kind of contract value range as well?
The contract value range is, we're on the second generation of the framework. The first generation, we decided to go over OJU, so anything above 3.5 million at that point. And very soon we realized that our bread and butter really is below that threshold. So when we reprocured, we decided to go anything above £250,000, and we lotted it. So we have five lots. The first 3 lots are up to £2 million, and then the first 2 lots, and from there we go up to 10 million in lot 4, and then lot 5 is anything above 10 million. So in the current framework, we have local contractors, basically on the first 3 lots, delivering smaller projects, and that is the bread and butter of the 6 authorities and other public sector bodies. And from lot 3 onwards, we tend to engage more with bigger organizations in North Wales, but also the larger players, national, international players.
So I think, and I've been furiously making notes as each of you has been speaking, and I think what I heard from you, Tanya, is that you are working within the same legislative framework. You have similarly positive policies to promote well-being, etc. But part of your problems are that you have less funding than elsewhere in the country. Even when you have major projects, it's difficult to find larger organizations to help you deliver them. Even if you find those organizations, you've got an infrastructure that makes delivery and access somewhat difficult. And you're losing skills and that sort of thing in the local population. So I think you've made a really good case that you've got peculiar difficulties in the north of the country as well. And I know from talking to you over the past few months, it's also really difficult for you as a framework and local authorities in the region to recruit and retain staff as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think, and that might be the case across the UK, to be fair, but we always have had this issue in North Wales trying to recruit specialists in particular, but I think now is more wider. Recruit and retain, and particularly in the public sector, that we have a number of constraints that when we are recruiting, and we are now competing very heavily with the open market, with the private sector. Whilst in the past, you used to say, well, if we work for a council or for a public sector, our job is safe and we have this great pension and all of these things. Those things are now being replicated potentially in the private sector, and also the fact that you have more the same flexibility now. Whilst in the past, being flexible working it was some exclusivity. Being to work flexible was an exclusivity of the public sector. Now it's more widely spread. So what we expect is that the pandemic help us a little bit, because now we do a lot of working from home, etc. So we might be able to recruit differently, but that benefit, I guess, is being felt by everyone. So it might just do the opposite. So yeah, we're in a perfect storm, unfortunately.
Well, I'm always an optimist, and I think what some people might view as problems, I'd like to view as opportunities. I can't resist adding in a little story of my own here about my work with, I've always worked in the private sector, but I remember a few years ago running some workshops for 72 public sector staff. We did them in batches of 15, 20. And my abiding memory was the preconception I had about public sector workforce was completely overturned, because what I was trying to promote was effectively change in their business. It doesn't matter what it was about. But the huge positivity in local authority staff who came to these workshops, because what they felt was that they were working in an environment where they weren't necessarily very well paid. Very often they were working with very out-of-date technology. They came under political interference year on year, budget cuts year on year, and they were working in a very deprived part of the country. All factors which might make their position a very unsatisfactory and unsatisfying one. But actually their enthusiasm to serve the community and to do more with less and to do the best that they could, I found absolutely marvelous and gratifying. And it's a sense I have, if I may, from you four, is that you're passionate about doing the best for the communities you work in. This is about you, not me, so I'll shut up for a minute. But I thank you for those setting the framework, as it were, no pun intended. I wanted just to look at some of the, so we've looked at some of the issues and constraints on you. I think we need to face up to some of the issues that might be affecting the supply chain. And in particular, I wanted to look at the vulnerability of suppliers in Wales. How resilient are they? What pressures do you do you see on your suppliers? I don't know where to start. Should we go back to Alid? In terms of the capacity of your supply chain to deliver what you need, is that capacity there?
In a word, no. I think we are obviously undertaking a huge infrastructure project at the moment in South Wales on the build the South Wales Metro, and I know there is a large gulf in the difference between what we need from I'll take labour as a bit of a example here, between what we have as a labour market and also what we need. We are seeing a lot of our tier 1 contractors crying out that this is a particular area, and the problem is a lot of people are undertaking infrastructure projects at the moment and are trying to pull from the same sources of both suppliers, materials, and labour, as I said. And I think that is a huge issue at the moment, and the availability of materials as well is going to be a continuing issue that we have going forward, because I think you can look at everyone on this call, and I think there's certain materials that we will all probably, from our contracts and our supplies, will all be pulling from, such as steel and things such as that. So I think it's obviously a huge issue for the supply chain at the moment, a huge issue for us, but also the ongoing supply chain. And the worry is that when there is added cost pressures that we're currently seeing as well, that some other aspects of what we've already spoken about in terms of social value and sustainability is kind of pushed away, looking for the pounds and pence. But that is something that everyone needs to bear in mind and try and push against, if I'm honest with you, because I think that when you have this sort of environment within the supply chain, that's when bad habits fall back into place, and that's something that we all have to try and avoid as well.
I like to explore material costs and material shortages a little later on in the session. But from your point of view, is it a skills issue? Are there not enough skilled people? I'm imagining some of the infrastructure projects you work on, are they labour intensive?
Absolutely, yeah. So we're a little bit different in the fact that when we're talking about our infrastructure project, especially the South Wales Metro and on the rail side, we have specific qualifications that are required to work on the railway. So that in itself causes us to have and it's not everything we purchase needs this, but a lot of the major contracts we have require a qualification, either risks or Achilles link up, to work on the railway. And this is a Network Rail standard, and it meets the Network Rail standard. So that in itself reduces the market of suppliers straight away. And also the labour that works on things have to be qualified as well to work on the railway. So with Sentinel and things such as that. So again, that lessens the pool that we have. But the point is that building a new infrastructure on the railways and wider as well, because it's all integrated transport, is very labour intensive, and people need to work at unsociable hours and through the night, and in sometimes not very great conditions when it's pouring down the rain or things such as that. So I think it's an industry that currently has a huge skills gap in itself, but also because you add on the qualifications on top of it, it exacerbates the situation.
And I imagine any kind of risk assessment that involves live rail, the potential consequences of mistakes or accidents is huge, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I'll perhaps come back to you, because one of my interests in the school is around offsite and modern methods of construction. So perhaps if there's time, I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about whether that helps relieve the labour shortage in your case. Similar question to you, Stefan, in terms of the capacity of your supply chain. How do you feel at the moment?
Yeah, I think from a works perspective, we're not seeing as much of an issue at the moment. We tend to work in 5-year cycles of funding, I suppose the pressure will be for us if we come into a peak period of construction. Do our incumbent supply chain have the capacity to stretch to meet that while still meeting the safety and quality standards that we'd expect? Primarily from a product supply, we're tending to struggle a little bit more. Our supply chain is struggling to get either the raw material or the componentry to finish goods to meet the lead times, and we're having to build that back into our procurement schedules. So we're planning better, looking to the left essentially in the program as to when we need to engage to get those products through. And I suppose one thing we've looked at within utilities is when we're casting the net, again similar to Alan, having sort of that rail experience, you've got to have the right qualifications in certain aspects. And if they're working on live track work, or similarly, if anyone's touching a high pressure main for us, they have to have the right qualifications and water experience. But what we're trying to do around that as well is spread the net a little bit further to people that work in regulated industries that have transferable skill sets that can come across, and then we can work with them to get that that water experience as well. But we also understand for companies it's a difficult process. Do they invest in the training if the work isn't there, or is it something they can sort of bleed into their organization as they go? So it's that double-edged sword, I suppose.
Well, it's very tempting for me at this point to talk about the resources available at the supply chain school, but I think perhaps we'll park that until later in the session. So, Stefan, you touched on product supplies perhaps being a problem, and I want to come back to that later. Again, you seem to be suffering from the same symptoms as Aled, in that you're in a specialised industry that requires strict safety measures and strict qualifications, and perhaps there is a shortage there. Is that something that there has always been, because you're in something of a niche sector? Have you always had these problems, or are they worse now than, say, 5 years ago? And also looking ahead 5 years, how do you see the future?
I suppose looking forward, an interesting one, because you talk about the unsociable hours potentially within rail and working night shifts. I suppose the same within utilities, that if you're working on waste, it can be unpleasant to work around, and there's probably a finite skill set. And I suppose what we're concerned with is that the skills in the industry retiring and sort of bleeding away, and nothing coming through behind that to back it up in terms of apprenticeships. But there's also a responsibility on clients there to give the market that pipeline of work for them to invest in that apprenticeships as well.
Thank you.
And I think sustainability, we talk about social value and other things. To me, sustainability means that we have a supply chain not just for the present, but for the next 5 years and the 5 years after that want to work in the industries that are critical. So
that continuity is as important to you as it is to your suppliers?
Absolutely.
I'll turn to some of the questions before I ask our other two speakers about supply chain resilience. The first one is very complimentary. Very early on in the session, Melita has said this is a brilliant, proactive and collaborative approach, which will really help the supply chain. So thanks in advance to Tanya, Kevin, Aled and Stefan. So thanks, Mel. I hope the event's living up to your expectations. The next comment is from an anonymous attendee. Most SMEs are not big enough to bid for frameworks or offer very specialist services. How do they engage with tier ones who are bidding for works or have existing frameworks? Information is difficult to get in Wales. Anybody like to pick that one up?
I'm quite happy to go with that one first, David, if you want.
Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, I appreciate what they're pointing out there. And I suppose there's a couple of ways of looking at it. Is, well, when we come out with frameworks, is looking at the structure. We do take into consideration proportionality and sort of looking at the framework structures to try and encourage SMEs. But as they were touching on there around the speciality, sometimes that's obviously quite difficult to achieve. So I suppose a couple of the ways they could look at it there is allowing that framework to sort of be awarded then, and then look at who's been awarded through the contract notices or actually contacting the framework to see if they can sort of get on Meet the Buyer events. But the other one that I just wanted to raise was the other method is to actually put in a joint bid. Now, I know, there was guidance and documents out there a few years ago around joint bidding and collaborative bids. I know that the market is a bit indifferent when it comes to that. Some embrace it, and we have seen collaborative bids come in on certain frameworks. Others don't want to touch it at all. So yeah, I just wanted to flag up really that there are, I suppose, toolkits out there around joint bid and how you go about doing it. And when we structure tender packs going out to the open market, they are welcoming of collaborative bids and joint bids there.
Thanks, Kevin.
Can I jump in as well, Dave, on that question?
Of course, yeah.
So it is something that we are working actively with our tier one suppliers on. So we do have a number of tier one suppliers who are working on what we call the core value lines at the moment. And we encourage them to advertise all their opportunities that they have on Sell to Wales, as well as we do. So that's something that's a route by which you can understand what opportunities are out there. And we've run a couple of sessions now with TFW with our tier one partners as well, for them to present what their forthcoming opportunities are as well. So that's a bit of work that we've been carrying out in order to make people aware of what opportunities are out there and where to find them as well. So I would say, from a TFW perspective, I can only talk from ourselves, that if you register on Sell to Wales, you'll see opportunities on there.
Thank you. I think somebody mentioned earlier Meet the Buyer events. Is this something that you all do as a matter of course, or is that less popular in this COVID-inflicted world?
Most of the things we do is virtual now. Sorry, Stefan, I jumped in there.
No, go on.
Most of the things we do are virtual now. So we've been running sessions called Supply Chain Platform to talk to the supply chain about different topics and things like that. But before COVID, I was attending Meet the Buyer events quite often, but it's mostly virtual now. Still, I think they're starting to come back in person a little bit more, but I think that's going to take a little bit of time to come back to the levels that they were before, if they ever do come back.
Yeah, sorry, David. I think Tanya, did you have your hand up or?
Yes, I did. Thank you, Kev. I just wanted to mention that it also comes to how we set up the frameworks. Us in the North, we started, as I said previously, with £3.5 million in the first iteration. On the second iteration, we went down to 250,000. And the way we tailor our lotting strategy was specifically to get smaller SMEs into the lower lots. And what we do is engage very closely with them with training, collaborative conversations, and we encourage them to have that close relationship with clients and other larger contractors in order for them to gain the knowledge to in future bid for larger projects and start developing them within the industry. So we definitely believe that collaboration is key, and close conversations, and encourage everyone to discuss training and to transfer knowledge is one of the areas that we encourage really strongly in order to support smaller companies to access frameworks. We also have a bulk of work that we don't put through frameworks, that we in a way leave it out purposely for companies that are not able to access frameworks to bid for those works. And we also put training as how to access our framework, how to bid, how to use the systems, what things we are looking for, what are our priorities, samples of how you answer questions, etc., and also try to simplify the way we ask questions, the number of questions we ask, how we collect the evidence at ITT and PQQ stages. So it's something that we do. I think all of us and all of the frameworks across Wales, we really want to support small companies to be able to access work in the public sector.
Thank you. Tanya. I'll move on to the next question because there are quite a few coming in. I don't mind going off script for a moment. From Gareth Davis, question to Welsh Water. How can the work effort be smoother to avoid peaks and troughs that they suffer from? It's difficult to scale and invest. I presume Gareth means for him, it's difficult to scale and invest in people and technology when there can be a significant movement in workload during an AMP cycle. So I guess that's the question about pipeline, isn't it? How can we get a more sustainable, smooth pipeline?
It is, David, and thanks, Gareth, for the question. I suppose it's the age-old question within utilities and potentially within other sort of infrastructure where you're working in 5 years cycles. There tends to be a peak workload within that AMP. I suppose what we're trying to do at the moment, particularly from a capital perspective at the moment, and frameworks we're setting up, is looking at greater allocation as opposed to mini competition within the frameworks. So our supply chain have an idea of what's ahead of them in the next few years, but also to integrate the design and construction a little bit better. So the teams are integrated earlier into the design phase and then moving through into the construction. That they're not waiting for Welsh Water, our design partners, to sort of beaver away with the design and then come out with the construction requirement. We're trying to integrate the supply chain earlier in that process, so they have visibility of what we need to deliver, but they're also contributing earlier in that project life cycle as well. But it is the age old, but it's always something that we're looking to improve.
Another anonymous question. Any suggestions of how a supplier can support Welsh communities if not based in Wales? Is not being based in Wales, does that preclude non-Wales based companies from tendering? And is there any weighting around that?
No, is the point here. That's all part of the public contract regulations and the utilities regs. It has to be fair and open and transparent. So we can't discriminate against suppliers based on where they are based. Now, there are new things of doing it in terms of reserved contracts, but that's something that is only used in a handful of cases on a county by county basis. But on the whole, you can't do it, and we have to be fair and transparent in what we do.
Nevertheless, just to push you a little bit on that, I would imagine that if it's a material supplier, if it's a supplier only providing material and not labour, you would perhaps have to take into account the distance, the journey travelled for those goods and the carbon footprint and so on.
Yes.
And possibly if it was a labour supplier, there would be a conflict then, a social value conflict, in that you would be taking away local employment.
Yeah, I'm happy. So yes, but this will form part of the evaluation. So in the weighting of the scoring, you'd have a weighting for price, you'd have a weighting for quality, and then within that you could have carbon emissions and things such as that. So as long as that could be taken into account, but it's also weighted against other aspects of the bid.
Yeah, and I think given the general comments that you've all made about possibly the difficulty in finding resources in the region, that might not preclude them. Sorry, Stefan, I interrupted you.
Just to follow up on what Aled had said there as well, if someone's coming into the area geographically as well, the question should allow them to answer the question of how they can invest locally, because again, sort of being on that private sector side myself for a period of time, you're looking for local resource, or you're looking for local subcontractors that can support, you're looking for local resources and materials to make the delivery of the works easier for yourself as well. So there's a natural synergy of investing locally to deliver works in Wales.
Yeah, and something I'd just add to that as well, David, is that, if someone is looking into Wales and looking to deliver, then you're looking at that area that they're looking to deliver that work. So a lot of the authorities have got their own kind of support services. So take Cardiff, for instance, we've got organisations such as Interworks Cardiff, which is like our employment services. We've got Cardiff Commitment, which looks around the sort of engagement with the youth. But also as well, a bit of a plug that the SUSCAP framework was successful in securing CITB funding to create like an on-site construction hub as well. So again, it's looking at the area that they're going into and seeing what kind of services are available. You've got charities that are delivering in regions, and also they need to just consider that you've got organisations linked to Welsh Government, such as Business Wales, Social Business Wales, and what was the cooperative that has now changed their name to Compass, that would all provide support and guidance to assist bidders, really.
Thank you. We've got questions coming in thick and fast. Another anonymous question. Some SMEs might have difficulties to invest in developing sustainable supply chains, in brackets, environmental aspects, technicality of materials, the recyclability, etc. Hence are limited in bidding. How can they find support towards these objectives? If I'm reading that correctly, it's how can they find support in helping develop their environmental aspects, or they're lowering their carbon footprints? I think I've interpreted that correctly. I'm biting my lip, trying not to plug the school here, but
I was just about to say, David, as a first step for people on the call today, is to look at the learning pathways for Wales and the infrastructure stream that they're involved with as well, to upskill as a starting point. I know we're working with the utilities fraternity to have a utilities pathway based on sustainability matters that are important to us. So it's free to use as well. It's an early, an easy first step, I think, in terms of that upskilling.
I must just spend.
Sorry, can I just say, if you are a Welsh SME as well, there is support available through Business Wales. So I think. Obviously, it only helps with Welsh SMEs, but that's a free. I think I can't remember what the thing is, but go to Business Wales and they can help you with your tender writing and other aspects of your business as well.
Great, thanks, Aled. I must just spend 30 seconds on mentioning the resources at the Supply Chain Sustainability School. So all of our speakers here today are their organisations are partners of the Supply Chain School. And what that means is they pay us a subscription and we in return offer them training. What it also means is though that any company that supplies to any of the organisations represented here today is eligible for free training through the Supply Chain School on a vast range of subjects. The beauty of that is that any learning that you undertake through the school effectively puts a digital tick against you, and that means that you've got something to display to your potential customers who are here on the call. And the other side of that coin is they can be reassured about the abilities and skills of their supply chain through looking at the training record that you develop through the school. Picture over. Comment from Melita. One of the ways would be to make the tender packs suitable to SMEs. Thinking of any tender and contractual dispensations wherein the works packages being let out to SMEs are not high on risk or duration and value, and maybe therefore don't need back-to-back positions on the head contract clauses, for example. She goes on, the beauty of Wales is that the SME community is doing a lot already, but maybe it's not being captured yet. SMEs are able to quickly adapt to innovative, sustainable solutions, offering you that all-important value for money. So I think she's perhaps making a point about the agility of SMEs, and I think I concur, Mel, that if large customers, clients such as yourselves can articulate what's required of your suppliers, SMEs tend to be agile, welcome that guidance and that framework to work in. Certainly this has been my experience. Tolu from the Growth Company, are Tier 1 contractors you have appointed to deliver frameworks required to report on local spend with subcontractors?
I'm guessing this one's for me, so the answer is yes.
I think that's quite a a common position, isn't it? Certainly we in the school are doing some work around off-site construction and whether actually off-site construction brings social value to projects or takes away social value. So in some respects, it adds social value in that it gives people employment in a far less hostile environment. It gives people long-term employment. It's a safer environment. It's a less dangerous environment. But at the same time, building buildings in a factory could potentially take away local employment. And I guess there's some tension there.
And sort of mirroring what Aled had said there, David, as well, particularly for our larger capital works and alliance partners, we require the same as well. It's to see that trickle down effect of the spend going into the local supply chain.
Yeah, thank you.
I just echo that as well, David, that not only from a framework perspective do we look at that, but from a council perspective as well, that we often get asked by councillors and members, the kind of Welsh pound that's staying in Wales or within Cardiff or whatever parameter it is, really.
Again, I did some work with a local authority in my region, which is in England, and they adapted this policy of trying as much as possible to keep suppliers and labour within the region. And what they found was that if you engage a local supply company, they in turn for their supplies will also stay within the region. And the multiplication of the financial value of that to the region almost rises exponentially. So I'm a great fan of local investment. Gareth Davis again. Are large employers within an area of limited resource? Sorry, let me start that again. As large employers within an area of limited resource, how are you preventing a market of ever increasing employment and material costs? There are many examples of employees moving between major employers in this forum. The market has a massive impact on smaller SMEs now they're competing and attracting and training staff. And actually, that's really where I wanted to go next with the conversation, is to look at rising costs and what it means to you. How can you procure labour and materials if the risk is that there's going to be a massive shortage or cost increase? Anybody want to pick up on that one first?
I can do. That's something that we have been looking at very closely, over the last 2 years. And it's safe to say that the market is, as volatile as it has ever been, and it's causing issues for absolutely everyone. From our perspective, the issues that we are having is that we have set budgets to deliver projects that are agreed 4 or 5 years ago. So of course, what you could buy with that money 4 or 5 years ago is not the same that you can buy today. So what we would like to see is a more dynamic way on which we set the budgets, more collaboration, work closely with the supply chain, less transfer risk potentially. Maybe we are at fault with that. We tend to transfer quite a bit of risk generally. Different approach to contract and to how we manage our contracts and our relationship with the supply chain, with the contractors in general. It needs to be closer. Those conversations need to happen earlier. We need to understand what our constraints and priorities from the onset. From our side, we do very early contractor engagement with the client. We have a pipeline, a forward pipeline that is published and updated every 6 weeks. So I think those are the things that we can actually do. But looking at the future is very difficult to predict what is going to happen, even the short term. So all we can do is to use the tools that we have at hand to try and support the industry in our different regions and to try and prevent for any more issues to happen, to create that collaborative, close approach in the way we work.
If I could just jump in as well, David, there and expand on that as well. Tanya just touched on the risk element, and I think something that we're focusing on and has seen a lot of at the moment is, the dynamics in the market, as Tanya said, has changed massively over the last couple of years. So what we're trying to do is, I suppose, change that kind of cultural thinking of, the race to the bottom, lowest cost is not always sort of the way to go as such. and also the clauses that are being considered and built in. So that allocation of risk, we're trying to sort of, I won't say educate, but it's just trying to sort of have that conversation around that we can't keep going down the same approach that we did 2 or 3 years ago. And something that we've done as a framework as well is looking at sort of forms of contract and funding training for sort of clients to sort of look at the various forms of contracts and the capabilities within those forms of contracts to consider some of these issues that we're facing at the moment.
Thanks, Kevin.
I think there's a point also, sorry, just very quickly on that point as well. I think within Welsh Water as well, if you look at some of our key materials, we'll hold frameworks for that, where we try and use our greater leverage to get better value, and then we share those down with the supply chain as well, so we take some of the risk of material away by dealing with that centrally as well.
Believe it or not, Stefan, that was the very question I was just about to ask. Do you, as a larger organisation with the buying power, try and smooth out that peak and troughs? Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Excellent. Let me go to the next question. Another anonymous comment. I wanted to just reflect back to a point that was raised about a single standardised approach to social value. With there being geographical, economic and social disparities across Wales, will there ever be a standard approach? Unless there is equal funding from north to south, then it will be difficult to level social value in communities. Do some of the legislation that we talked about earlier, does that actually provide a level approach across Wales, or do you see these regional disparities?
I think probably if I just step in there, if I could, I suppose when I touched on like a bit of a standard approach, what I meant there was, around the use of, say, TOMS as a measure or the use of a particular platform. And I think, if I'm being honest, we're probably not going to be seeing that anytime soon. I think people have got different opinions on various platforms and various measures that are being used. In terms of a standard approach to, say, at what we're asking for from the market, then you have got to consider the various factors within the regions, and so it's unlikely you're going to get that. This is a standard document. That's what we want you to deliver across the whole of Wales. Yes, there's going to be similarities up at the high level of what the policies and the acts are about, but I always say within Cardiff in general that when you start looking at some of the measures, you're talking about localized measures there, and it's where you draw that sort of band of what is local to that project. Now, sometimes that might be local within a community within Cardiff, say down Cardiff Bay. They might be focused on what they want delivered, as opposed to, say, the north of Cardiff. But other times then the scheme might be bigger, that we should be looking at Cardiff as a whole, or even as the whole of the capital region. So it is very much dependent on what the scheme is, and what we're looking to achieve from it, really.
Can I just jump in there as well? That it has been fed back to the Welsh Government that they need to be the ones who come up with a standardised approach if it does happen. And I know it's something that we are. There's a number of public sector organisations who have fed back that to the Welsh Government. So it all depends on how they want to go in terms of how they want this to be measured. But as Kevin said, I wouldn't expect that to happen in the short term.
I think we are talking about a framework for benchmarking, isn't it? That we are all measuring and looking at in a similar way and collecting our information in order to benchmark and understand what delivery we are having, and also how it compares to the different similar regions. But definitely it needs to be tailored to the needs of each community, and that's what we are in agreement that is happening currently. We are all tailoring our ask to the communities, to their needs of the communities. What we don't have necessarily is a standardized way of reporting and benchmarking against what we are delivering.
Okay, thank you, Tanya. What I'd like to do as we go into the last 15 minutes, we've still got plenty of questions, and I've also got some questions. My colleague Rosie is on the call, and I hope, Rosie, you could put in the chat, please, a link to the feedback form. It's really important to us at the school that we get feedback from you, our audience, about the relevance of what we present. We are funded by our industry partners. We take steerage from our industry partners. They generally tell us the issues we should be addressing and how to do that. And we like to understand whether or not we're doing that correctly and relevantly. So when Rosie drops the link in the chat, please take a moment at the end of the meeting to give us some feedback. If you like what we do, we'll do more of it. If you don't, we'll do better. I will just keep addressing some of the questions in the Q&A because they're very relevant. One from Di, a slightly skeptical viewpoint. Di's company is based on the Welsh border in Gloucestershire, and her experience is different from what we've been describing. Contractors, she said, almost without exception, consider cost as the most important factor with no apparent thought to social issues. And she's also found that being based in Wales actually does count as a major plus point to securing work in Wales. And she's hoping to hear about ways to get around these base difficulties. Do we accept that tier ones are cost focused above all else?
Can I come in with that one? I think it pretty much depends on how we spell our contracts, I guess. From our perspective, what we have been doing is pointing the tier one contractors into what are our priorities, and those should be cascaded down to the rest of the supply chain. Of course, we cannot mandate how they engage with their supply chains, but we can outline within our contracts how we expect them to work with us and how we expect the supply chain to work in our projects. So I guess you should be seeing less of that and more of the social value clauses that are intended to smooth that disparity within just price only.
I'd agree with that, Tanya. It's how the contractor's contract is essentially incentivized, and that will help shape their procurement strategy for a standalone project or the larger framework that they might sit in.
Thank you. For what it's worth, Di, this is my 46th year in the industry, and I think I would have been as skeptical as I suspect you are for 40 of those 46 years. I genuinely believe the industry is changing and changing for the better. And my experience with the tier one contractors that are partners to the supply chain school is that they are genuinely taking social value very, very seriously. And the number of appointments in those big companies for people who address social values issues is quite remarkable. So I accept your 30 years of disappointment, but I genuinely believe that change in the industry is upon us. Another anonymous question: how do we obtain key contacts for organizations represented here and those relevant supply chain managers on tier ones on frameworks? I would hope all of you on the call that you'd be happy for us to share your contact details with the attendees. Excellent, thank you very much. And going back, this is one from Jane O'Leary. The question is about a standard metric rather than standard delivery. Different platforms measure in different ways, and there is a large cost for some of the platforms. Anybody want to pick up on that?
I think we've kind of discussed it previously.
Okay.
However, one of the things, talk about TFW, we're currently looking at the way we do measure social value. And one of the things that we are trying to achieve is that there would be no cost to the suppliers. In terms of accessing the system. So I think that's one thing that we are trying to address there. But as we said, every authority, every organization is different to how they are measuring and how they want to measure at the moment.
Yeah, and
Thank
also
you.
I think, sorry, the efforts should be targeted towards the delivery and maximizing that delivery of benefits rather than on the reporting. So that's why we want a simplified way of reporting that is inexpensive under a specific framework that we can utilize and spend, those precious time delivering the benefits to the communities rather than thinking about how we are going to report on those.
Paul Morant is the next. The next question is from Paul Morant. I now believe in serendipity because Paul is asking precisely the question I was going to ask you all at this very moment, which is, would any of the presenters like to share a particular success story where social value was delivered innovatively or particularly well? That's the question I was going to ask Paul, but you phrased it much better. Any great examples of successful social value implementation? And I only want a brief description. We're into our last few minutes.
Great. I will cover it. So it was basically around the furniture, delivering the furniture for our new headquarters, actually. That the supplier that we used utilized 30%, reused 30% of our previous furniture. They reused 49% from other organizations as well. So that's a total of 79% recycled furniture, so the circular economy. And then 13% of the others were locally sourced and including 3% made by Merthyr Institute for the Blind. So that's the type of thing that really encapsulates some of the things that we're trying to think about, that innovative working, think about circular economy and reuse. And we saved over 90,000 kilograms of CO2 by doing that. So that is the type of innovation and an innovative way of working that we've used on that contract.
Great example, and great that you've got some measures that you can quote. Anyone else got a favourite social value one? Kevin?
Just a couple to lob in there as well, David, is I suppose, again, similarly, we've utilised the company in the past, Greenstream Floor and Social Enterprise, who look at the upcycler sort of old carpet, and sort of bringing that back into renovations. So that's been a really good, successful example there. We've also utilised, like you sort of say, old 3G pitches that are perhaps end the life for like a new school, but have gone on to sort of fulfill the benefits for the community sort of initiative elsewhere then. So it hasn't gone end of life, it's been reused. Yeah, I think there's probably quite a lot we could touch on really there.
Excellent, thank you.
I can come in with one with community benefits, if you like. And it's in our framework, all of the contractors in the lot came together to deliver a cohort of the Princess Trust. And we engaged with 17 individuals that were needs. And we have been tracking them over the last 6 years of whether of that cohort that we delivered, how many continue in employment and how their lives have changed. And out of the 17, 10 went into employment, and currently 8 continue in permanent employment and have changed their lives completely. Their wives are working, their children are in education, they have managed to buy homes. So it was a really big effort amongst the contractors and the clients in the framework. And I think it's a really successful story from people that probably would not have had the opportunities otherwise to enter the job market and to continue and change their lives, and the impact that has in the economy is huge.
Thank you, brilliant. I think as we go into the last 5 minutes, the key question, I suppose, that I'd like all of you to just have a go at answering is, what can the SMEs and other organisations that are presumably the attendees of this event, what can they do to improve the quality of their bids and give themselves the best chance of success with you? Anybody want to pick up on that?
I'm happy to lead off, David, if you want to.
Thank you.
Sorry, Tanya, I jumped in just before then. I suppose when I'm looking at bids and some of my sort of counterparts in the procurement team, the answer to the questions we get, ultimately, the procurement exercise is generally set up to solve a problem that our organization has, and we need the support of the supply chain to solve. it's probably incumbent on us to ask the right question in our tenders, but essentially try and decipher the problem statement we have and how you can help us solve that problem. Don't sort of rest on your laurels of what you've done before. Look at our problem now and answer that so what question. You have the experience, you have the competency, you have the capability. How will you apply it to the problem that we have? I think that sort of sets answers apart for us in a tender.
Thanks, Stefan.
I think if I just jump in there as well, I think for me, it's probably just, it sounds obvious what I'm probably going to state, but it's amazing how often we see it. And that is, expanding on what Stefan just said, really, is that read the question and see what it's actually asking you. There's nothing worse than perhaps seeing a cut and paste job from a previous tender that is still naming the previous scheme. So, it is sort of looking at what you're putting forward, making sure it's addressing the question, read that question and understand it. And again, if you don't understand something as part of a tender process, then making sure you put that clarification in during the tender process rather than second guessing, really. And again, probably the other aspect would be, if you have worked for the organisation before, don't just naturally assume the bidders know who you are and are going to score accordingly. We can only score by what's in front of us. So, make sure you spell it out, really.
Yeah, thank you. Aled?
Tanya I think is ready to.
Thank you, Aled.
I was going to say the best till last, Tanya, but you go ahead.
Okay, then I'll go. No, it's okay. I think engage with us. We do meet the buyer events. We do try and engage with the market early on before we put our tenders out. Talk to us, come forward with your questions, understand our priorities, understand our, constraints. That's important. Engage very, very early on. Of course, during the tender exercise, perhaps we cannot answer all of your questions, but we can do it before then, and it's go early and talk to us, and also utilize the support that we put together. Sometimes the training that we do through Business Welsh on how to use the tendering systems, on how we expect the questions to be answered, etc. So all of the support that we prepare beforehand, before we put the project out, just utilize it and talk to us.
Thank you, Tanya. And Aled?
And I think most of the things I was going to say have already been mentioned. It's the simplest things that can trip suppliers up. And we talk about 6 golden tendering rules, which have already been mentioned in terms of reading the questions in full. Don't assume that we know your organization's cultural capability. But the one thing I would say is, back up your answers, provide the evidence, provide the backing of what you're saying, and just proofread your response before sending, because sometimes you can see or get someone else to proofread it for you, because sometimes you get word blind. But it's sometimes those simple mistakes that people don't spot that can trip you up and get lower scores. So keep it simple, and it's the simplest things, basically.
Yeah, thanks, Aled.
Sorry, if I could just add 2 more points there, David, as well. I suppose the other one for me would be to also, if you're including additional documentations, make sure the referencing is correct, and that does actually reference the question. Sometimes we are sort of scampering about all these sort of pages to try and find out what's relevant to that question. And then also, it is perhaps taking a step back and looking at the weightings of the scorings and that. And, if it's like, say, a 5-10% weight in there, focus your question and be concise, because, if there's another 30% weighting question over there, that's where you're going to gain the more marks. So, don't put like sort of a 10-page answer in for a 10% when sort of 2 or 3 could have done the job.
Thanks, Kevin. I think as we come to the end of the session, what I'm taking away from all our speakers here is that they have a job to do. They need to do the best for their communities. And in order to achieve that, they need to work with you, the supply chain. This isn't a you and them. the closer you can work with these clients and the more you can understand what's required, the better your opportunities as suppliers will be, and the better results that all our speakers will achieve for their organisations and their communities. So I've been really, it's been a privilege to chair this and to hear from you, and thank the audience for some fabulous questions. Our speakers, if you haven't read the Q&A, at least one of our audience is very pleased with what she's seen, and thank you, Mel, for those very kind comments. And perhaps if the audience feels that another session to drill down into more detail would be valuable, then I'm sure we at the school will be happy to host that. One final reminder, if I may, just to click into the chat box, follow the link to give us some feedback, please, good, bad, or indifferent. Meanwhile, my sincere thanks to all our speakers, Kevin Shaxson, Ali Tweesh, Stefan Isles, and Tanya Silva. And 1 minute over, I'm afraid I need to close the session, so thank you all for attending.